You are listening to an American Free Press podcast.
Joining me on the line is Kalev H. Leetaru, the Assistant Director of Text and Digital Media Analytics at the Institute for Computing in the Humanities, Arts, and Social Science at the University of Illinois. Kalev, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's exciting to be on the show.
Kalev, there was an article on the BBC's news website, the title being Supercomputer Predicts Revolution. Feeding a supercomputer with news stories could help predict major world events according to U.S. research. Before we get into that, why don't you explain to our listeners exactly what an Assistant Director of Text and Digital Media Analytics does?
A lot of my focus really revolves around how do we take all of this incredible data around us today. We've reached this point now where there are almost twice as many words posted on Twitter each day today than there were in the New York Times over the last 60 years. In the next 3 years, if Twitter keeps up its current growth rate, there will be more words posted to Twitter over its lifespan than in all the written books published on Earth in the last 600 years. And so we've really reached this point now where we just have incredible amounts of content that's being generated every second of the day, and all of this is in digital format. All of this is available to computers. And at the same time now, we have these computing systems today that can process, that are beginning to reach the scale where we can really start processing this stuff. And so really what my work revolves around is how do we take this enormity of data, how do we take these incredible computation systems, and especially these new ways of thinking about computing, and mix those together and try to come up with new understandings of the world around us.
Okay, two things. One is for the listeners who might not be familiar with it, because I know I don't use it. What exactly is Twitter? And the other question I have after that is, although there is so much more information being produced by entities like Twitter, is it really quality information, or is it a lot of LOL or variety of other types of internet chatter?
That's a good question. Twitter is one of many services out there today in the social media sphere. And the idea behind Twitter is that you send short little text messages to your friends on your phone. Well, wouldn't it be great if there was a public website that you could send short little messages to, almost like a sort of a running bulletin board? And so that's really what Twitter is about, is you have to summarize what you want to say in 140 characters. And the idea behind things like Twitter is that they're real time. You can put stuff up there as fast as you want. And there certainly has been a lot of work coming out that suggested that, wow, Twitter is breaking things very quickly. There was a great little study that came out after the recent earthquake that was felt in D.C., the one that caused the crack in the Washington Monument. And someone actually did this map where they showed people tweeting about the earthquake in real time, and they showed how fast that was happening vis-a-vis the earthquake itself, and it almost matched the rate of the earthquake coming out. So there are interesting questions about that. That said, on the other hand, there are other studies that show, for example, that there are more Twitter users in California and New York per capita than in the rest of the United States and in Europe. There's a lot of open questions about what is social media. There was a study that came out a little while ago that suggested that a good portion of social media revolves around technology, computer games, or latest software, or things that are more technology-oriented versus the mainstream media, which covers more of the business-oriented types of things, or the world events. And world events in particular are critical because very few of us have visited Syria recently. Our understanding of the events on the ground in Syria is being mediated by what we're hearing and seeing in the news media. So social media is a great sounding board, in my opinion. There's been some great work in terms of trying to understand what happens in social media versus mainstream media. But that's an open question. That's an area we still don't know a lot about. And in my study, one of the things I found was that if you were trying to forecast the Egyptian revolution, you could have done a pretty good job just from monitoring traditional old media, mainstream news media, than you could have using social media. And one other point I'll add is that there's a lot of things that have been attributed recently to social media. For example, a lot of these flash mobs, or a great example is the recent riots in London, where the first thing that came out was, well, these are all being caused by people organizing on Facebook and Twitter. But ultimately it came out that, well, actually, these were actually being organized via encrypted messages on BlackBerries. So traditional sort of text messaging to each other, not using social media. So the jury's still out. I think social media has tremendous potential, but I think a lot of the really interesting things that are happening on social media are not in public view. I mean, you look at Facebook, and yeah, there's some 300 million plus public profile pages, but the vast majority of your college students or your average person on the street, they probably don't have their profile set to full public. They probably have their images or their messages private. And so if you go and you just grab what's public on Facebook or Twitter, you're probably not getting that good of a picture of what's happening about human society. But I think things are changing. Who would have thought 10 years ago that people would just post their thought of the moment publicly for the entire world to see? I think it has tremendous potential. I think obviously we need to understand it better. In the traditional world, for example, let's say you're an intelligence analyst, a traditional newspaper, for example, it probably has been around for a while. So you're able to get a feel for what are the potential biases here? What are the potential ownership structures? Versus a blog might come and go in a few days. And so you really don't know who's putting this information up. What do I need to understand to be able to work with that content? And these are all these types of questions that have to be addressed in the future. But I think it's a brave new world. And I think that as more and more work is done, we're going to have some really exciting things to be able to look at.
Now, the study, Supercomputer Predict Revolution, feeding a supercomputer with news stories could help predict major world events according to U.S. research. And of course, the article is talking about your research. And the article goes on, a study based on millions of articles charted deteriorating national sentiment ahead of the recent revolutions in Libya and Egypt. Now, I studied the article and I studied some of what you have on your site, which for the listeners, I'll give it to them. It's your name. It's www.kalevleetaru.com. And a couple of the things I focused on was the number of articles that you fed into this supercomputer, and I think the name of the supercomputer was Nautilus, right?
Yep.
And that supercomputer is at the University of Tennessee, I believe, reading.
Yep.
You're in Illinois, and you fed over, is this right, 100 million articles into Nautilus?
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, so the idea is to try and capture as close as I could what's happening around the world. So I fed it a whole bunch of different collections that totaled about 100 million news articles from around the world, stretching back about 25 years. I also have the New York Times in there that stretches back 60 years as sort of a comparison point, but most of the work focused on the last 30 years. The first thing I did is I took those 100 million news articles and I used software that went through and picked out every person mentioned in the news, every company, every organization, every terror group, every location, every action, and all the connections between them. And that ended up being this gigantic network of 10 billion people, places, things, and actions connected by 100 trillion relationships between them. That's bigger than any computer available today. And so what I have to do is I have to look at it in bits and pieces. So it's kind of like shining a flashlight around a dark room where you're looking at a single part of the room at a time and you're trying to see, is there some interesting pattern over here that I might want to look at? So I ran software that basically start looking at this gigantic network, and that's really where you need the supercomputer, is to be able to analyze even bits and pieces of something of this magnitude. You really need machines of that class, and this is a big Silicon graphic supercomputer. It has 4 terabytes of memory, which basically is just many, many times the average desktop, and it's really designed to handle big amounts of data. Now, one of the first things it came back with is that the tone of news about a country, so if you take all the news coverage around the world and you look at all the news coverage about a country like Egypt, it seems to move in very interesting ways over time. And simultaneously to this, if you look over in the economics literature, you'll see that there's been a lot of studies coming out about how the tone of the news media and the social media can forecast future economic events. So there was a great study, I think it was earlier this year, by a group out of Indiana University, Twitter predicts the stock market. And so they showed that the tone of tweets can be used to forecast future movements of the stock market. Simultaneously, you've had lots of studies coming out about how the tone of blog posts can be used to forecast movie sales. And so the question was, tone towards a country seems to move in interesting ways. On the other hand, the tone of news coverage seems to be able to predict economic events. Well, could we forecast human events, social events, just by using the tone of news media? And it turns out there's a history for this. If you go back to World War II, in the lead up to World War II, the U.S. and the British intelligence agencies start monitoring the news around the world. And they were reading the news not to read what was happening in those countries, because obviously they had much better ways of knowing where the tanks were in a given country. What they cared about was the tone. And so, for example, the first report that was filed by the predecessor to the CIA in the U.S., it was dated the day before Pearl Harbor. And it said that the Japanese media had become sharply more negative about the United States and had dropped all of their appeals for peace. And obviously, this was the day before Pearl Harbor. What they really learned is that you can learn so much about what the tone of the news media is, how countries are portraying each other. And that can give you just tremendous tremendous insights beyond the factual information, because news is really, it's a container for factual information, but it's really a container for views. If you think about the college football game, two teams come together, they have a football game. They go back the next day, both of their hometown papers are going to report on that football game. They're both going to report the same factual information, the same score, the same things that happened, but one newspaper is probably going to cast it as a wonderful game, a fantastic show. The other newspaper is probably going to portray it as a huge disappointment. If you look at the factual information, you just have two identical reports. But by looking at the tone there, sort of looking between the lines, if you didn't know which paper was supporting which team, you would get a much better idea of what are the connections here, who's supporting whom. And so the idea then is scaling that up. So one of the things that the paper did is I took, for example, a sample of all the news media around the world over the last quarter century that discussed Egypt. And this comes from radio, from broadcast, from print, from internet, and this is translated from vernacular. So this is where they have highly trained translators that take each of these articles and translate them into nuanced English. So they care, is this the word no or the word never? And so what I did is I scooped all this up and just took the average tone of all news coverage around the world about Egypt each month over the last 30 years. And what you find is if you look up until January 24th, so you use only what you would have had in your hands right before the revolution, you find that, wow, the tone of all the coverage around the world towards Egypt is just plunging towards negativity and really has reached points that we've never seen before. And Mubarak, in the same way, if you look at the tone towards Mubarak, you see that, wow, in 30 years of his rule, it's never been this negative. And if you look at what President Obama said in the early days of the revolution, he made some comments partially in support of Mubarak. And so you have to imagine that if there were some super secret classified assessments that the U.S. believed that Mubarak was going to be forced from power, probably those statements would have been more restrained. So this is probably a good indicator that even in the darkest corners of U.S. intelligence, they probably suspected that Mubarak had a better chance of surviving. And probably a lot of that was based on looking at history. If you look at the last 30 years, he survived everything. But that's where this can really become into play, where this will probably never replace human analysts, but it gives them critical tools where if you're an intelligence officer in early February and you're trying to figure out, is Mubarak going to stay or is he going to go? By looking at a graph like that, you could see that, wow, the entire world has turned against him. So he's lost credibility on the world stage. So no matter how badly he wants to stay in power, he really doesn't have a choice anymore because he's lost his credibility. And having information like that, I liken it to weather forecasting, where no one would ever say that the weather person does a perfect job, but it's good enough.
Yeah.
It gives you enough information that you know that tomorrow I need to bring an umbrella and not do outside activities. And so that's really why I call it forecasting, not predicting, because I don't think you'll ever reach the point where you can say mass protest tomorrow at 5 o'clock on the street corner. The point of this research is to say that it seems like you can get to the point where you could say, wow, we've reached a point where there's massively increased risk for something happening in Egypt. The idea behind this work is to say, wow, there's some fascinating things that we can do to forecast, but then also that, wow, there's this whole world here. If you think about all this information around us, oftentimes the news media calls it this ocean of information. Well, if you think of it as an ocean, really we spent the last few decades looking just at the surface, just at the waves, and we've never looked underneath it really. We haven't really spent a whole lot of time looking down, and there's this whole world underneath it. And part of the idea behind this work is to say, wow, there's some incredible stuff down here to take a look at. And one of the other aspects of the study was to say, well, could we have used the news to predict where bin Laden was hiding? A few months prior to his capture, obviously, they had a pretty good idea of where he was hiding, but could we have gotten advance warning of this? And so what I did is I took all the news coverage over the last 10 years, because really he's only been in the news for about 10 years now. I took all the news coverage from around the world and used a tool that extracted out all the location references. So I looked for every city, every hill, every stream, every mountain that's been mentioned in news coverage around the world about bin Laden and plotted those on a map. And what you end up with is this map of the world where all roads seem to lead to this 200-kilometer radius in northwestern Pakistan, which includes the city that he was captured in. Now, it doesn't name that particular city, but it basically tells you that, wow, no matter what country you look at, the news coverage about bin Laden seems to center around this particular set of cities up here. That raises all these questions of why did that work? Is that because journalists get tips from intelligence officers, so they cover that area in more detail? Is it because bin Laden figured so much is happening here that no one will look for me here? It raises all these fascinating questions. And indeed, this notion that, well, the tone of the news around the world would actually give us insights to country stability and to the notion that some countries might collapse. It raises some fascinating questions about how does the news work? How does media work? And what can we learn from the world? And another really interesting finding is so much of the world revolves around the internet. And one of the things I discovered is that this media monitoring service that I use, which is run by BBC Monitoring, which is a partnership of the British government and BBC to monitor the news around the world for intelligence purposes, one of the fascinating findings there was that they've been around for 70 years. They monitored first broadcast, then print, and obviously internet. And what was fascinating is that over the last 15 years, the percentage of their news media that they monitor that comes from web sources has grown at almost the rate of the internet. And last year, almost half of the news coverage around the world that they monitored was from the web. And some of that is traditional news outlets that are on the web now, and some of that is web-only sources that exist today. And one of the really interesting findings that raised then was, well, what would happen if you just use Google News? Would I get the same picture? And it turns out that if you go to Google News and you use only the English language content on Google News and you run the same approach on it, you end up with an identical picture. You get the same thing that forecasts the Arab Revolution. Now, again, if you care about what the Egyptians themselves are saying, you still obviously have to monitor the local media around the entire world. But this notion that if what I care about is what the world is saying about Egypt, it's a fascinating question about why did that work? Why does English language web content do such an interesting job of forecasting tone and stability around the world?
A lot of folks might think that because the U.S. mainstream media is almost a monolithic entity, that they're telling you what they're doing in unison. They're telling you, well, geez, you should feel that it's very negative because we're about to do something. Could it be that? Could it be that they're so linked with the U.S. government, with the intelligence agencies? When Eisenhower said, beware of the military-industrial complex, a lot of knowledgeable people now believe, should be now, beware of the military-industrial financial, media, and so on complex. Does your research give any insight into that?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons for working at this scale is if you look at just the Egyptian media prior to Mubarak stepping down, you saw it was pretty restrained. There really wasn't much coverage about the revolution, and that coverage was very anti-revolution, and that's because the government had such control over the media system that it went to great pains to try and leverage the media system, try and keep people away from joining the revolution. I think that that's one of the benefits, though, is the rest of the world was definitely not restrained. The rest of the world was very much talking about Mubarak having no future and the country likely sliding into revolution. And so I think that's one of the benefits of working at this scale is if you were looking at just a few hundred or just a few thousand news articles, that would be a big deal. You would have a lot of concerns with that. But when you go to 100 million news articles, that's a real different animal. That's a point where it's much more difficult to try and poison things at that level because you're looking at every country. And so if you take some country around the world, obviously the friends of that country will be publishing probably pro-news articles. Countries that are against that country will publish anti-news articles. Those in the middle will publish neutral articles. But when you work at these breathtaking magnitudes, it becomes much more difficult for someone to try and poison it like that.
Mm-hmm. Does your research give you any indication of the degree that the U.S. mainstream media might move in lockstep?
Well, there was an interesting finding. There's been a lot of discussion about the civilizations of the world, and Samuel Huntington had his 1996 book that was titled The Class of Civilizations. He put forth his view of the 10 civilizations of the world. And there's been lots and lots of these works where people have said, well, here's how the countries of the world fit together. But most of those are based on theory, or they're based on trade ties. So who's trading with whom, or who's gone to war with whom. And one of my questions was, what would happen if you used the news media to try and look at that? And so one of the first things I did is I took every news article and I took all the cities mentioned together in a news article and connected them together. So I'm looking at framing. So for example, all the articles about Paris, let's say at the bottom of many of them, they also mention some things happening in Cairo. Well, if that happens again and again and again, that's indicating that for some reason, this media outlet is framing events in those two cities as having something to do with each other. Obviously, you'll have lots of little articles here and there, but if that becomes a constant thing, that's reflecting some deeper framing issue that the media is presenting. So I made a map of the world over the last 30 years. It's an animated movie, and you can go see it on the study website. And what it is it takes all the news coverage in the world, and it takes all the cities that are connected, and looks at the average tone of all articles that mention those two cities together, and you end up with basically this map of the world where there's lines connecting all the cities based on whether they were portrayed portrayed as being positive or negative together. And one of the fascinating things about that is you see these really strong cohesion structures. You see groups of cities that were really tightly connected, and you actually see conflict break out. You see groups of cities become sharply negative and then spread to nearby cities, and then you see it arc across the world. So you see these fascinating connections, and so then that raised the issue, could you use this to try and find the quote-unquote natural civilizations of Earth according to the news media? So essentially what I did then is I took all the news media in the world, grouped it together, and then looked at every article that mentions France. How often does it mention Spain? How often does it mention Brazil? How often does it mention Australia? And made this big network where basically you can picture every country in the world being a node on this network, and the connections between them are how often they appear together. And then I used tools that looked at what groups of countries tend to be mentioned in the news more with each other than with the rest of the world. And it turns out when you do that, you end up with 6 major civilizations. And you end up basically with the US being connected to Latin America, most of Africa being connected. But you end up with fascinating trends like France being connected to the majority of Africa, which is reflecting colonial ties. You end up with Spain being connected to Latin America, again reflecting colonial ties. You see these fascinating breakdowns of the world that are really reflecting a lot of how the media views itself. But going back to your question, one of the really interesting findings was that when you looked at the New York Times, so when you made the map of the last 60 years of human society based on the New York Times, the entire world revolves around Washington and New York. You have this map where it's basically tendrils, almost like an octopus, tendrils reaching out to every city, because one of the things you learn in journalism is you cast events in a foreign country in terms of your domestic audience. So in the New York Times perspective, when they cover something that's happening in a foreign country, they're putting it in context for their American readership. So that might include a quote from the president, that might include, if it's economic, what impact on Wall Street is. Obviously, journalists know that the world revolves around the U.S. when you're writing for a U.S. audience, just as a French newspaper writing for a French audience portrays the world as revolving around France. But what becomes so starkly clear here is it just becomes so vivid when you look at it to see, wow, this map really shows how much that really is the case. When you look at world events, how much that really affects what you're seeing about the world.
Mm-hmm. And this is fascinating stuff. Where else is the U.S. greatly connected to in terms of these media ties? Were you able to discern that?
Primarily, actually, just Latin America, Mexico, and most of South America and the Caribbean. I mean, obviously, then Latin America, in turn, is connected to Spain. If you look at the world according to the New York Times, on the other hand, a huge portion of the world revolves around the United States. And Latin America actually is portrayed as having more in common with portions of Africa and India than it is with the United States. And a lot of that likely reflects, again, just how events are contextualized for a local audience.
Seems surprising that there would be some kind of a connection between the U.S. and Latin America. You would think more it would be along the lines of the U.S. and the United Kingdom.
Well, and I think a lot of this has to do with just this notion that if you look at it from the other side of the world, a lot of times countries get grouped proximately. And a lot of that happens to do with the U.S. probably has a lot of interaction with Mexico. Mexico, in turn, has a lot of interaction with its neighbors. So you have a certain sort of transitive effect where countries usually have the most interaction with their neighbors because they're their neighbors. And usually that can oftentimes lead to much stronger connections between them.
And perhaps it has something to do with the large Hispanic population in the United States. Would your research able to discern that?
No, that was actually one of the things. A big portion of this research was to sort of show what's possible here, what could be done. There's a tremendous amount of more work that's going to be required to try and understand, well, why is this possible? Why did this work? The primary purpose of this paper was more to just say there's a whole world here. And there was a paper back in Science last December called Culturomics. And what they did, it was a team of Harvard researchers teamed with Google, the Google Books group. And what they did is they took a sample of about 4% of the books ever written, and basically they counted up how often a word appears in books published during each year. So you can type in a word, and you can see how that word has become more and less popular over time. So that was also sort of one of the driving forces behind this, was this notion of look what's possible. And really, if you look at their paper, it really was about, well, look what's possible. If you look at these scales, look what the interesting types of things you can find. And so this paper really is in very much the same vein, where the idea is basically to sort of point out there's a whole world here. It's almost like in the ocean, it's like saying, wow, there's coral reefs, there's all kinds of amazing stuff down here. It's going to require so much future work to try and understand, well, why are these coral reefs where they are, and what are all these new species down here? Right. This is kind of just to say, wow, there's something down here we should be taking a look at.
Right. It's almost like the Matrix, a whole world that people aren't even aware of until somebody like you comes along and says, wait a second, look at this. In the article, Kalev says while the analysis was carried out retrospectively, scientists, I imagine they're alluding to you, say the same processes could be used to anticipate upcoming conflict. So you have to wait, obviously, for the news stories to come out. But the news is there, the tone is very negative, and it works. It's clear. There were no examples of where tone became very negative and it didn't work, right?
Correct. And actually with Saudi Arabia, one of the findings is that the tone of Saudi Arabia was pretty constant. It didn't move very negative or very positive. And sure enough, Saudi Arabia didn't really have very widespread unrest. And indeed, today, Saudi Arabia still has not encountered the same type of unrest that the other countries have had. So it seems to suggest that when you see sharp trends in negativity, you have a much higher risk of unrest. When the tone is pretty stable, that indicates that it's much more unlikely that you'll have unrest there.
Mm-hmm. Were you concerned when the results came in that you might have somebody in dark glasses and kind of like a couple of guys from Men in Black knocking on your college door there and going, hey, mister, we like your computer program. How about handing it over?
One of the ideas behind this is, and one of the purposes of the actual paper, I recreated. So the stuff I was doing on the supercomputer with all the large network analysis, when it came time to do this paper, I recreated that using a much simpler technique. This notion of, instead of this network of 100 trillion relationships, I basically said, well, you can also do the same thing for this type of research by just finding the articles that mention Egypt and computing their tone by month. So it's something that others can reproduce much easier, other researchers or potentially the government. And one of the ideas behind this is to really serve as sort of a thought piece, that this by no means is the silver bullet that will solve all of the world's issues. It's more to say there's this whole new way of thinking about information. And I think there could be nothing better than for groups like the intelligence community. Again, they've collected this news for 70 years now. And I think there could be nothing better than a group like them stopping to think and say, wow, is this a new way that we could use this information that we've been collecting? In the same way that I think that academics, I think there could be tremendous opportunities for media studies, for journalism to try and understand how news flows around the world, how news shapes opinions. And then even the digital humanities, I think this really gives really interesting ways of sort of peering into the soul of humankind in some respects, of sort of the global society, if you will, and being able to sort of quantify that in many ways. I think there's a lot of interesting things. There's been so much done in the humanities over the years about theoretical ideas. So this finally gives some quantitative data that might have some potential.
It's almost like this is who we are.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned Osama bin Laden. There are a lot of folks who have studied Osama bin Laden, who have studied 9/11, and who don't have the theory of what happened according to the government's line, that a guy in a cave with a satellite phone was able to shut down the country with the best defenses in the world's history and have these planes fly around for an hour and a half. Not one jet was scrambled, and planes knocked down these huge buildings, although there's never been one instance where a steel frame building has been brought down by fire. So there's a lot of skeptical people out there who are looking for answers about 9/11, and there's a lot of these folks who have felt that Osama bin Laden died in December of 2001 because there haven't been any photographs of him, nor have there been any real recordings of him. So when this news came out, where again the U.S. media all walked in lockstep about this guy, yeah, he was killed, he was thrown into the ocean, that's him definitely, no pictures of course. A lot of folks are saying that wasn't Osama bin Laden. Besides, he's been killed 10 times already? He died in December 2001. They killed somebody else. We didn't get any evidence. Now that would beg the question then, if this is the case for those folks who are skeptical out there, and I certainly am one of them, I'm absolutely skeptical about that story and about 9/11. Let's say we look at this Osama bin Laden history and let's assume that that was not Osama bin Laden. What does that say about the media, where you could pinpoint it down to 200 kilometers, but let's say for argument's sake that wasn't Osama bin Laden? What would that say about the media?
One of the ideas behind this is to look at the media globally. So in that notion, you're looking at media from across the world that is placing them in that location. Certainly here in the U.S., we obviously are familiar with American media. It's the media that we consume the most. But really, if you look across the world, America is just one country like many. And so I think it's highly unlikely, certainly in this day and age, that American media necessarily sets the tone for the entire world. And certainly in a case like 9/11 or like the Iraq Iraq War, some of my other work that I've done with a colleague earlier this year, we looked at how the world reacted to the 2003 invasion of Iraq by the U.S., and we looked specifically at how countries framed that. So how different cultures reacted. Was it us versus them, or was it more clinical? The United States invades another country. And there's a whole bunch of findings there, but one of the root findings was that there is no uniform notion of, quote unquote, the media. Every country reacted so differently to that, from totally clinical language to a number of Arabic and Persian language media and countries that really framed it as us versus them. 50 years ago, you only had 3 broadcast news stations in the entire United States. Your daily news on TV was coming from one of 3 sources in America. Even here in the U.S. today, that's long since gone past. And certainly across the world now, I really don't think that you could say that there's one media, that it all moves in lockstep. I think that when you really combine the world's press together, you really are getting, because every country has different views, different ideas, different interests.
No, I wasn't alluding to the whole world. I was specifically speaking of the U.S. press, because the major media outlets in the United States are owned by just a few groups.
And I should add specifically that this particular study specifically did not look at U.S. media. And one of the reasons for that is that the data set that I use from the British government, that's a counterpart to the news source that the CIA and the predecessor to the CIA have run. And the CIA is banned by law from monitoring U.S. press. And so the British, because they're partners, follow the same convention. And so this study actually did not use, outside of the New York Times, it did not use other U.S. media. And so I really couldn't comment much on how uniform the U.S. media is. Looking at other countries, if something major happens in a particular country, obviously most of that country's media will rally around that. So in the case of the Iraq War, certainly my own research in that case showed that the majority of the news media in the United States decided to cover the beginnings of that invasion. But I think there certainly isn't as much uniformity in terms of, well, how is it covered? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? When the announcement went out that he was killed, you saw very different reactions around the world. Obviously, most countries, most presses were very positive about him being killed, but you saw actually certainly certain areas of the world and certain news outlets that were very negative about the news that he was killed. Again, going back to that question of looking between the lines, that gives you some real interesting insights to what's happening around the world and what the biases and potential interests are around the world.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard of Operation Mockingbird by any chance?
That doesn't ring a bell.
Okay. Kalev, I imagine you're still monitoring the global news media, whether it's the traditional print or the newer digital news media. Are you seeing anything, any predictions, anything happening that you might want to tell the listeners that it's piquing your interest right now?
One of the things about this analysis is that right now, this was sort of a pilot. This was to sort of prove that there was some interesting analysis that could be done here. And so right now, it still requires a lot of computation power. So I haven't done as much. The focus was what's possible here. That's where most of my work is focusing right now, actually, is on making this work in real time. And in fact, potentially making a public website where people could go and view this material in real time about the world. And so right now, I don't have any good predictions right now, simply because I'm actually focusing on making this work in real time, bringing it up to date so that it updates every few minutes, and making it work at the city level. So that, for example, if you're the mayor of London, you'd be able to know that London might be heading more for unrest versus just the entire country. So those are kind of the directions I'm going in. So the forecast I would offer is the one that I have in the paper about Saudi Arabia, which is the fact that in the paper I showed that, hey, the tone seems to be pretty level here, and 5 months after the study was written, it's still solid, it's still here. So, I think that kind of proves out what's possible with this.
Mm-hmm. And back in November of 2008, you were in the news, and very interesting news story. Why don't you tell our listeners about that briefly?
Yeah, so in 2008, I collaborated with another researcher here at the University of Illinois named Scott Althaus, and one of the things that we found, he was actually doing a paper about the Iraq War. He studies coverage of war. And one of the things that he was looking at was the changing coalition of the willing and how that was reported in the media and how that influenced various things. And just a simple little routine thing. He had a paper that was being published, and one of the things that he cited in his references list in his paper, he was citing the official press release about the coalition of the willing as a footnote in his paper about the list of the countries that were part of the coalition on a particular date. And this paper was going to press, and the journal came back and said, well, that URL you sent us is a blank page. And he went to it and saw it was blank and thought maybe it was just a typo. And so he asked me, and we went to the Internet Archive, which is just www.archive.org. And this is a nonprofit group that's been archiving the web since 1996. And their job basically is they constantly crawl the web. Google has the Google cache feature, so you can click and see what the last version of a page was, but they delete that each time. The Internet Archive keeps a constant archive of the entire web going back for 15 years now. And so we punched this URL went to the Internet Archive, and we saw that, wow, there used to be a list here, and then they deleted it. And we looked further, and what we found actually is that there were actually several copies of the Coalition of the Willing that were different press releases on the White House website, and those are being changed constantly. So the White House was adding countries or removing countries from that list, and they were keeping the date the same, or they were post-dating it or dating it in the future. So, for example, they might remove a country from that list. So, for example, Costa Rica was originally on the list, and then they removed it about a year later. So the original list in 2003 mentioned Costa Rica as one of the names. Then Costa Rica was removed, and they left the date the same, so that if you were looking at that a few years later, you would see, oh, well, Costa Rica was never a member of the Coalition of the Willing. And other countries were added and removed, and dates changed, much like 1984. And this raises this question of how do we trust electronic documents in the electronic era? In the paper era, White House press releases are distributed to all the federal depository libraries, which are based usually at universities around the country or major public libraries. And in the old days, if the White House wanted to change that, they would have had to go around to send men in their suits and their sunglasses around to all the libraries to hold those papers and update them. But in the digital era, it's as simple as editing a web page. And to some degree, that may not even be intentional. It may just be, well, maybe someone made a mistake, or maybe that really was supposed to be removed. But this notion that, well, in the web, is a document really an official document anymore? Does it make sense to go back and change previous documents to reflect current events? And to what degree can we even detect that anymore? This had gone on for several years, actually. They have been altering these for, actually, up until 2006, I think. They were constantly updating these for almost 3 years. And 2008, no one had seen this. And the only reason we stumbled upon it was that in one case, they didn't just change the list, they took it down entirely. And again, we wouldn't have seen it unless he had cited this in a paper, and he was just citing that list as a list in his paper. And some sharp-eyed editor at the journal said, wait a second, there's a blank page here. And without archives like the Internet Archive, we never would have been able to find this. That's one of the amazing things about the digital era is we generate so much now. How do we keep track of this? How do we ensure that what we see right now is the real thing, hasn't been modified? And, it'll be a fascinating world.
Yeah, it is fascinating. Of course, we talked earlier about this before the interview, and that story from '08 was picked up by the U.S. mainstream media. But this recent story about the supercomputer predicting revolutions is pretty much being covered solely across the pond in Europe.
Yeah, that's actually the interesting thing is that 2008 study was picked up in the New York Times and ran across the U.S. It got some international coverage, but not dramatically. This new study actually broke in Europe and has made it across the European press and spread across a good portion of the world now, but really has not been covered in the U.S. And so, again, it is this fascinating cleavage across how the media system functions around the world.
It is amazing stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's gotten quite a bit of pickup in Europe, but almost nothing in the U.S. so far. So it's kind of interesting. There's almost like this great barrier between the U.S. media system and the rest of the world's media system.
Kalev, in this BBC article, you said that your system appeared to generate better intelligence than the U.S. government was working with at the time. Can you explain that?
The origin of that was that if you look in the early days of the Egyptian protests, U.S. President Obama came out in support of Mubarak. So he was very measured in the beginning, saying that we like to support the democracy and such. But really, he came up very short of saying, let's get rid of Mubarak and let's support the protesters. So one has to think then that if in some deep, dark, secret back classified room, if U.S. intelligence had believed that, well, Mubarak is definitely going, he's obviously out the door, that one would assume then that President Obama's remarks then would have been a lot more against Mubarak. So if you look later on, early February, as it became clear that it's increasingly likely that he may go, and then finally, obviously, right as he was about to go out the door, then you saw the U.S. stance towards the protests really change. But in those early days, the data that my tonographs show is that, well, the world had turned against Mubarak. Egypt was at an unprecedented situation. And so with that type of information, you would have at least known that, you know what, there's actually a decently good chance that Mubarak may be out of here. If the U.S. had really believed that Mubarak was going out, if U.S. intelligence had assessed that he was leaving in the early days, I would have expected that Obama's remarks would have been a lot more measured towards him.
The fact that your system is generating better intelligence than the entire U.S. intelligence apparatus, do you think that this would be applicable to other matters besides Mubarak?
I think one of the issues that you run into is intelligence is really based around humans. It's based around this notion of someone's been sitting on the Egypt desk for 30 years, they've watched Mubarak through the decades, and they've seen him survive everything that's ever come up against him. And so naturally, their gut instinct is to ignore the news data. Yes, there's all this new information coming out, but a human's gut instinct is to take take what's happening right now and try to connect it to things that have happened in the past. It's sort of natural to say, well, he survived all these things, so we're going to go ahead and assume he's going to survive this. And it's also a little bit of the frog in the frying pan. If you're watching Egypt every single day, you may not notice that it's steadily becoming a lot more negative over time, that the world is really turning against it, versus a machine, it doesn't have those issues. To a machine, it's just cold, hard numbers. It's seeing the fact that this really is uncharted territory we've never seen before in terms of negativity. So really, it's not subject to a lot of the issues that face traditional human analysis of material. There's two main reasons that machines are being looked at for this type of analysis. Obviously, one of them is scale. Machines can look at a lot more, a lot faster. But the other part of it is that there's really this recognition that with the Arab Spring and with a lot of these other situations, there's a tremendous amount of data there. But it really is hard for a human to take themselves out of the equation and say, well, this is what I remember, this is what I've known of the country. But to put that aside and say, well, what is the data telling me right now?
Have you been approached by the intelligence community since the articles came out?
I mean, I think that these are the type of things that are greatly interesting to those type of groups. And I think that there's a lot of interest in this type of work right now.
Right. I had asked if anybody from the intelligence community had contacted you after all the press came out about your study.
It's definitely, I think, something that is of great interest to them.
So they have contacted you?
I would just say it's something I think is of great interest.
That's great. Now, what's going on right now, Kalev, with the Wall Street protests? That's not a revolution, of course, but is this something that your system would be able to pick up on?
This is, again, one of the reasons that we're really focusing on trying to make things work in real time right now and speeding up our analysis so we can start looking at these types of things as they occur. The Wall Street protests are very interesting in that you had this large displeasure with Wall Street that eventually escalated to some people protesting. But then you had a real catalyzing moment there was that the YouTube video of that New York police officer pepper spraying those 5 or however many women it was, protesters. And that was a huge catalyzing fact. The number of people participating in these things skyrocketed after that, after the news coverage it generated. That's obviously an area where the ability to do these types of analyses in real time, not even delayed by a week or several weeks, the ability to do this type of analysis minute by minute is going to obviously be crucial to analyzing situations like the emerging Wall Street protests and the others that are following it across the country. But to what degree are people viewing this as just a few young unemployed college students that are taking a break from school, or to what degree are people viewing this as a real movement? And those are the types of things that, again, there are things that we're looking at. And as we move this technology towards more real-time analysis, these are the type of things that we'd be able to explore.
This might be the beginnings of course, you saw that movie Minority Report, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is almost like the beginnings of something like that, the precogs.
A number of outlets have likened it to psychohistory from the Isaac Asimov novels. And it actually is closer to that. So in the Isaac Asimov novels, there was this notion of psychohistory, which essentially was you take all available knowledge about society, you plug it into great big machines, and you can't forecast the individual actions of a single person. But what you can do is you can begin to forecast broad social movements based on this type of information. And so I don't think we'll ever get to the point where I can say, you are going to do X tomorrow at 5 o'clock. But I do think it becomes much more likely that we can say we're reaching a critical breaking point where it's more likely that such and such is going to happen. And I think that by itself would be a massive step forward to be able to say, you know what, it's highly likely that Mubarak is going to go. It's highly likely that certain things are going to happen.
Kalev Leetaru, the Assistant Director of Text and Digital Media Analytics at the Institute for Computing and the Humanities, Arts, and Social Science at the University of Illinois. I want to thank you so much for the time you've spent explaining all this to the listeners. It is a fascinating study. Looking forward to visiting your website and following this news, and looking forward to talking to you in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a great day.